So this second video in my two videos on Stalin and World War II is going to look at how Stalin managed the war. Paralysis, then determined leadership. Stalin was shocked by what had unfolded on June the 22nd. It is thought that he suffered some kind of breakdown, and for more than a week the Soviet Union was virtually leaderless, when previously every decision had been channeled through Stalin. Alan Bullock refers to the meeting Molotov and other members of the Politburo had with Stalin at his dacha on June the 30th. Anastas Mikoyan, and I do hope you appreciate my blundering attempts at these pronunciations, Anastas Mikoyan, who was present at that meeting, later wrote, "We found him in an armchair in the small dining room. He looked up and said, 'What have you come for?' He had the strangest look on his face, and the question itself was pretty strange too. After all, he should have called us in." The inference was that Stalin seemed as if he was expecting to be arrested. Khrushchev also later commented how in late July he visited Stalin in his underground headquarters in Moscow's Kirov metro station. Khrushchev recollects, "The man sat there devastated and couldn't say anything, not even any words of encouragement, which I needed. What I saw before me was a leader who was morally crushed. He was sitting on a couch, his face was empty. He was at a complete loss and didn't know what to do." He would recover though, and had to some extent at least before his meeting with Khrushchev. His rallying radio broadcast on July the 3rd suggests he was up for the fight. "All citizens of the Soviet Union," he said, "must defend every inch of Soviet soil, must fight to the last drop of their blood for our towns and villages." I think Churchill would have been proud of that speech. But he will have had dark moments nevertheless. To again quote Khrushchev, it was only in 1943, after the Soviet Union's first big victories, that he began to strut about like a rooster, his chest puffed out and his nose sticking up to the sky. Before then, he had walked around like a wet hen. Of course, we know that Khrushchev did all he could to point the finger of blame for the Soviet Union's problems at Stalin. You will recall Khrushchev's secret speech, so perhaps we should take his recollections with a pinch of salt. Nevertheless, he was close to Stalin, and we shouldn't be surprised if at times, particularly in 1941, Stalin did indeed have dark moments. But he did rally. A state defense committee was set up consisting entirely of civilians, and with Stalin as its chairman and Molotov as his deputy. It's described by Jeffrey Hosking as the supreme war directing body, with powers to issue decrees affecting all organs of party, state and armed forces. It met almost daily. A supreme command post was also established with Timoshenko in charge, though Stalin dominated it. This consisted of the chief of the general staff, all marshals, and the heads of the various armed services. And with Stalin as supreme commander and chairman of the State Defense Committee, the military and civilian contributions to the war effort were coordinated, and order did return. Stalin brought to his military role the same gifts which he showed as a politician. His quickness in grasping a situation, at least after the initial shock of the German invasion had subsided. His ability to grasp detail, his remarkable memory, his self-confidence, again after the initial shock had subsided, and his capacity for hard work and long hours. He was also prepared to get rid of anyone shown to be incompetent and promote wherever he saw promise. He was also able to learn from mistakes, though never admitting them. Averell Harriman, who negotiated the Lend-Lease terms with the Soviet Union before serving as America's ambassador in Moscow, provides a useful description of Stalin at this time. I saw the other side of Stalin, his high intelligence, that fantastic grasp of detail, his shrewdness. I found him better informed than Roosevelt, more realistic than Churchill, in some ways the most effective of the war leaders. The trouble was that he also brought his old faults. He was stubborn, he would refuse to accept bad news, and he did refuse to admit and often act when he was wrong. And he had a neurotic suspicion. The size of the problem and the Soviet response. In the spring of 1942, the Soviet problem was considerable. The territory Germany occupied accounted for more than 40% of the Soviet Union's population. It also included the vitally important Ukraine, the Soviet breadbasket, and the Donbass region, a major coal-producing and industrial region. So that, in addition to the loss of people, farmers, workers, and potential soldiers, the Soviet Union had lost or had seen destroyed more than 60% of its coal production, almost 70% of its pig iron production, almost 60% of its steel production, 60% of its aluminium production. It wasn't all available to the Germans. Much had been destroyed by the German attack, or else deliberately destroyed by the Russians as they retreated. But it wasn't available to the Russians either. Russia had lost 60% of its grain production, half of its cattle, almost 3/4 of its pigs, and more than 80% of its sugar production. Whilst the number of available horses, still an important resource in war, as well as farming, in the Soviet Union at least, had dropped from 21 million to 8 million. But as the Germans advanced, the Soviet Union undertook a desperate transfer of industry and people on a scale that can hardly be imagined. The State Defense Committee set up a special evacuation council, and between 10 and 12 million workers were moved, as many as 2,500 industrial enterprises, more than half of them described as large, and 50,000 small workshops. This meant machinery, including machine tools, rolling mills, presses, hammers, and turbines, huge things. Here's an example of the dismantling of a steelworks in the Ukraine. In only 19 days, from the 19th of August to the 5th of September 1941, they were removed from the Zaporizhzhia steelworks 16,000 wagons, that would be railway wagons, of vital machinery, including exceptionally valuable sheet steel rolling mill equipment. The generator of the large turbine at the Zuevo power station was dismantled and loaded in 8 hours. All this Machinery and equipment went to the Volga region, the Urals, Siberia, Kazakhstan and Central Asia, out of reach of the Germans, including their bombers. And it wasn't long before they were reassembled and contributing to the Soviet war effort. An entire aircraft factory relocated to the Volga produced its first MiG fighter within 2 weeks of the arrival of the last train carrying the factory's equipment. Factories were also converted from peacetime goods to wartime needs. For example, a children's bicycle factory in Moscow started making flamethrowers, and a typewriter works began to manufacture automatic rifles and ammunition. The tractor factory in Chelyabinsk was converted to make tanks. Members of the State Defense Committee were in daily contact with these plants. If there was a hitch, Stalin would send a telegram warning those responsible that non-fulfillment of the daily plan would be seen as a crime of state importance. So terror was still applied. Gosplan produced an emergency war plan for 1941 too, and thereafter annual plans, and the State Defense Committee, under Stalin's chairmanship and meeting almost daily, as I've said, kept a tight control on how the plans were put in place. With Stalin's chairmanship, it had full power to make decisions so that any hold-up to production or the transportation of raw materials or finished armaments could be quickly resolved. As I've said, daily and monthly, quarterly and annual targets were set for standardized weapons and for everything that was needed to make them, from labor supply, energy, raw materials and machine tools. Civilian consumption was reduced to the absolute minimum. Lend-Lease was vital to the Soviet war effort too, but the success of such a massive reorganization was nothing other than impressive. In 1942, more than 25,000 aircraft were produced, 60% more than in 1941. More than 24,000 tanks were produced, 60% more than in 1941. By 1944, more than 3,000 planes a month were being produced, so that in the final stages of the war, the Soviet Union had an advantage over the Germans of 20-1 in planes. A truly remarkable achievement when one considers the losses the Soviet Union had faced. It was the first 6 months of 1942 that was the most critical period, when despite everything, production was higher than its pre-war level. Here lies a crucial factor in any explanation for the Soviet Union's ultimate victory. Stalin and his generals. As for the Soviet army, Stalin had a very good relationship with his generals throughout the war. His chief of operations stayed in Moscow at his side. The others oversaw operations in the field, and Stalin was in communication all the time with them. Stalin wanted to be involved in all decisions and would make clear his own preferences. But he was not a military strategist, and he was prepared to listen to his generals if they gave him a convincing argument. This is shown in the discussions leading up to the Soviet offensives in the summer of 1944, when Marshal Rokossovsky, who had already spent 3 years in a labour camp, twice stood his ground Stalin accepted his opinion, declaring he liked generals who knew their job and their own mind. In October 1942, Order Number 307 abolished the system of dual command, reintroduced in the desperate times of July 1941, whereby political commissars had to agree to military decisions before they could be carried out. Their role was now restricted to political education and welfare matters, though they would look out for any sign of disloyalty, and they did encourage soldiers to join the party. But the army had won back Stalin's trust. So Stalin's management of the war, and after a disastrous start, his management does stand in stark contrast to that of Hitler's. He did a much better job. So I hope the two sets of videos, the one looking at Hitler's management and these two videos looking at Stalin's management, helps in your understanding of the way in which the war in Eastern Europe went. But for now, as always, I do thank you for listening, and I remind you to check out my History Made Easier website. But for now, cheers.